Thank you very much for those words of introduction. Amelia, I remember the last time I gave a lecture, Rodrigo, well, he didn't really introduce me. He just said, "This is Jonathan Sergison." And in my experience up until then, there were two types of introduction. One was where someone really took care to think about what it was they wanted to say about why they'd invited me. And another version is where someone just looks at the website and you just hear again what's on the website. And Rodrigo's was the coolest ever, which was just, "This is Jonathan Sergison." So you said a lot more. It was almost a monologue. The other thing just to clarify is that Rodrigo was very clear that he wanted me to only talk about my work as a teacher, which is what I will do. But it's really a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm delighted to contribute to this next issue of the Porto Academy. I was struggling to remember when the last time was, but you said it was 2014. I thought it was 16, but I should remember in relation to the age of our daughter, who was also in the audience on that occasion. So for me, this is really a lecture where I feel like I'm playing at home. The Academy is a school I've taught in, as mentioned already, for 15 years. And I intend to really share with you 15 years of working as a teacher. By way of background, I've been teaching since 1991. So that means that I've been teaching for longer than I've been in architectural practice, 32 years. And nearly half of the time I've been a teacher, it's been in this school. So these are some background things. I have been a full professor in Mendrisio since 2008, and I was invited to become the director of ISUP, which is the Institute of Urban and Landscape Studies, which I founded in 2019 here in Mendrisio. My life as an architect has always been divided between two forms of practice, teaching and professional practice. And there's a third activity, which is a practice of writing, and this invariably acts as a bridge between these first two forms of practice. For those of you who are attending the Porto Academy Summer School, the setting of our school must now be familiar. But when I joined in Mendrisio, it was a relatively young school when I started. And for me, it was immediately clear that there was a conceptual structure that the school was exploring that was seeking to distinctly differentiate it from the two federal polytechnic schools in Switzerland, namely ETH in Zurich and EPFL in Lausanne, which are, as their names imply, more technical in their orientation. So the founders of Mendrisio, and I think you're going to meet one of them in the coming days, quite consciously aligned the school from the outset with a humanist tradition in architectural education. And frankly, from my point of view, this appeals to me greatly and explains why much of my teaching activities have addressed urban and social concerns. And here, an archive or a cataloguing, a documenting of all of the work I've been doing over 15 years in the Academy. I've got to really compact this. It's a crazily ambitious lecture where I'm trying to give an account of so many semesters. But I was sort of trying to calculate in preparation that I must have taught something like 1,620 students in 15 years in master's and diploma level. And so really uniquely, this is a lecture that is not about Sergison Bates, it's really about the work of the students of the Academy. And I begin with a document that was made during the COVID period where the students shared the conditions in which they were working. For me, this was kind of fascinating, but it just reminds me that Mendrisio is a sort of uniquely special place in Europe, lying south of the Alps, close to Milan, but there's a gentleness that prevails in this region of Switzerland. And I think it engenders a great deal of focus that the students apply to their work. And my students are consistently encouraged to work in both a digital and an analog way, and this is evident. I rather like this photograph of two French-Swiss students who finished Hoog anyway. It feels like the guys are doing all the work in this image, and their friends and colleagues are probably making critical comments. This is where you're staying, yeah. So this is a rather representative expression of this wonderful building where many students in the Academy live, but not all, and it's, again, fascinating to see this kind of relationship to place. So, first semester, Taro was in the studio. I began teaching with an ambition to look at London, the city I was living in at the time. And the first semesters, there was a lot of attention that was given to London, and we were also working with the office of the Mayor of London and some brilliant people who were in that office at the time. And we started by looking at Deptford, an area of southwest London, looking at a rather large area of the city. You can see the River Thames here and Deptford Creek, and the work that was done by students working sometimes on their own and sometimes in groups of two or more. And really my favorite project from that semester, it's sort of, and Taro, I'm not showing it because you're here, but it always struck me that you did something genius in terms of making London feel like an Italian city and one that we all know rather well. The next semester turned attention to Somers Town, an area where indeed we lived, and looking at the topic of making a school, a public building. The students began by traveling widely through Switzerland, learning from many schools, wonderful schools that have been built in Switzerland in the last 20 or 30 years, including the work of my colleague Valerio Giatti. And here is Somers Town. The site that the students worked on is for the Edith Neville School, and their work was really a form of test planning because more recently the school has been built, unfortunately not by one of my students. Maya, we used to live here, yeah. So I highlight two projects from that semester amongst many. Here, one that's looking at an idea of creating these sort of units of classrooms with a very generous shared space, and another collaborative work, a distorted cross-shaped school where playgrounds are placed on the corners. From Somers Town, we then looked at an area of London around Tottenham Court Road, Charing Cross Road, Oxford Street, New Oxford Street, where Design for London within the Office of the Mayor were very interested in the students looking at workspace with all of the changes that we can now see. The students, when they came to London, looked at many wonderful examples of office buildings in London. Perhaps this the most famous and notable, The Economist. And here, some record of the studio at the end of the semester, over emphasis on model making at very different scales as a way of exploring proposals for a number of sites in this area of central London. And as is evident from this accounting of the work, the task of making an office is in some ways quite a simple one, especially in relation to, say, the complexity of housing. A lot of discussion was about the representative qualities of the office buildings that students were developing. And still in London, in the fourth semester, we turned our attention to the area of Bloomsbury. Irina, you look worried. Is everything okay? Okay, good. And this area in the center of the city, so the previous semester we'd been looking at this area between Euston Station and St Pancras, and the previous semester had been in the bottom left corner of this aerial photograph. But here the interest was really looking at the qualities that I would argue for that exist in the Georgian London house, and an interest in the way that the window acts as a negotiating element between inside and outside, which is what this essay was exploring. As ever, a lot of survey of examples of housing and the influence I think this had on the work of the students. A contemporary exploration of what a new London terraced house might be. By the way, Daisuke and Stephen are now really rather famous architects. This is their work when they were students. And then we really left London. I think this is the only semester where we left Europe. We looked at the city of Tel Aviv. And particularly the area of the UNESCO World Heritage part of the city, the so-called White City of Tel Aviv, the area that was planned by the Scottish urbanist Patrick Geddes. And the students looked at many areas, looking for places where they could make an argument for a form of densification or a sense of bringing some kind of coherence to the urban fabric. And in this year, there was an overall interest in the theme of modernism as a contemporary vernacular. From Tel Aviv, the next semester, we worked in Sardinia, in this small town, Palau, in the northeast corner of Sardinia, working very collaboratively with Alberto Ponis, and here a recording of some of the many houses by Alberto Ponis that we had the good fortune to visit. And this is Palau with its sort of wonderful setting and projects that attempted to interpret the, let's say, the vernacular of this part of Sardinia. It's touching for me to see the authors of these projects. Michael Stettler has been working with me in Zurich for more than 10 years now. Then we decided to go back to London and worked in this area of London on two sites that sat either side of where our office in London was at the time, on Newman Street, and sites that we knew that were being considered for rather large redevelopment. So here the projects looked at mixed-use programs, mostly housing and employment uses. I'm always rather fond of these studies, which are the work of Matt and Victor, which were looking at the organization of facades. Louis, at this point I should say happy birthday. That slightly threw me and everybody else. And then we began on the first occasion working in the largest city in Switzerland, in Zurich, working with the urban office of the city. We selected a number of sites which have subsequently been, some of them have been developed. A sort of fascination with type. Here, a student's work that looked at the theme of the courtyard and a rather dense form of housing. And the work of two students here that look at the perimeter block. And Oliver, I think we could agree that this feels like a kind of Zurich housing in this image. So from Zurich, then we returned to Italy, and this time to Naples, working with my friend Ferruccio Izzo, looking at the Roman Greco historical center of the city, this kind of amazing, dense urban tissue, and with Ferruccio's help, identifying a number of small sites where we could explore forms of affordable or social housing in the old city. And projects that look at very kind of careful and dense forms of planning, always this exploration of the idea of a facade and the manner in which it contributes to urban life. And here, a collection of studies as models in these very particular sites. And then in 2013, we worked in Bucharest on a site that is really rather problematic. It's an area of Bucharest that was substantially demolished as part of the bigger project of building the palace and this big urban scheme. And the projects looked at an area that was really a void in the city and developed solutions for how it could be more coherent in the future. Here, that ambition is perhaps most explicitly communicated, this collection of approaches which are very urban in scale. And then we decided not to travel very far. A work on Lake Lugano, a few kilometers from where we are now, and a beautiful site that sits on the lake, and a semester where we looked at the hotel as a building program in this rather idyllic setting. And because the work was so close to school, we organized a study trip to England. And at that point, I hadn't been living in England for several years, and I could see the English landscape with fresh eyes. It was a really memorable study trip that we made. But I think the hotel as a building program is sort of fascinating for this sense in which it bridges between very public and representative uses and, of course, the quietness of what a hotel room should be. And at this point, we traveled south, 50 kilometers from Mendrisio to Milan. I remember when I was interviewed for my position in Mendrisio, I was asked what my future teaching projects might be, and I said I was really interested in working in London, which you can see I was. But I remember Marcel Miley, who was on the commission, said, I would expect you to work more in Italy. And it took me a while to make sense of Marcel's gentle encouragement. So in this semester, we were indeed working in in Milan, and trying to interpret the sort of wonderful architectural tradition that exists in that city, the legacy of the work from particularly the 50s and 60s. And then we traveled to Berlin, a fascinating city in many ways. For me, it sort of strangely reminds me of London, but with a very different history, of course. And in this semester, we were working in a rather typical area of the city to the north of the center, and a project of densification and urban repair, which, of course, when one considers the tragic history of the city, is still a necessary program. On this occasion, our critics at the end of the semester were Martin Steinman and Roger Diener, and they were quite amazing. And Roger said that this was the first time they'd ever done a review together. Martin was particularly on his best behavior. It was a great discussion, but I think they always are. We then went to Turin, and in this semester, we worked again at a larger urban scale, and the type that the students explored was the palazzo. Oliver, you were on, yeah.
First time in Mendrisio.
But not the last. And we were working on a site next to the huge cemetery in the city, and the work at the first level looked at an urban development, and then it looked more in detail at buildings. And eventually the kind of qualities or atmospheres that the interiors of those buildings might hold. And then I was contacted through Stanny van Mors by the widow of Max Bill, and we were asked to look at a project that would create a cultural center for his archive close to the house that he built just outside of Zurich, and a semester where we looked at art space on this site that the pointer doesn't work. Anyway, a collection of projects that look at art space and the relationship to landscape, and this house, indeed, by Max Bill. The site at the moment has the infrastructure of the water company of the canton of Zurich, and some students elected to remodel and repurpose some of that infrastructure. And then we were asked by an organization in Hasliberg, which is a small settlement in the canton of Bern, and in the Swiss Alps, of course, and a project where we were invited to explore multi-generational housing. So the students worked on a number of sites and projects that anticipated this housing program, which I think is a fascinating one, but also an architecture that is of the Swiss mountains. And I hope it doesn't feel like a cliche to anyone who's Swiss, but I think the sort of the image of these buildings rather seriously attempts to interpret in a contemporary way this Swiss alpine vernacular. And then there was a period of 6 semesters where we worked only in the city of Zurich, and if I have time, I'll come back to that, which then brings me to a semester where we worked in Lugano, and again a project that has a level of reality in the city, the Viganello region of Lugano, and these buildings that were formerly used by the Postal Service. This semester, we invited the students to work with a building type which was a palazzina, as a building, and each student, or pairs of students, explored that in very particular ways. Here, looking in great detail at the way an apartment could be organized. And invariably, an attitude to landscape and the sense of how the space between works. And at this point, it was teaching which had a relationship to the COVID pandemic. So I set a project that was as close to the school as possible, the beautiful Valley de Mugio, which just lies above where we are now, some 10 minutes from here. And we worked on 7 small settlements that sit either side of this valley. It's a valley which, on the right-hand side of this aerial photograph, has the border with Italy. On the ridge to the right, on the left, the village of Monte, where I have a house. So it was again working locally. Well, it's not exactly a surprise. I mean, I'm not giving away state secrets. So the students began by drawing very carefully these settlements, trying to understand their structure, how they are very pragmatic in the way that they work with topography and landscape. They're very compact, and drawings that are really trying to make sense of the inherent structure of these beautiful places. And to understand them, it's necessary to draw in different ways. But this drawing I particularly like. It's of a small piazzetta in Campora, trying to understand the making of a small urban space. And a lot of work, a lot of drawing, a lot of trying to figure out what the atmosphere of a building that would add to a place might hold. And here a drawing that gives an account of the proposals the students were making to rather precisely add to these 7 settlements. Here a project for a small tower house. And I almost can't remember what the project is in this image and what is the older existing tissue, but it is a model, and in fact the project sits at the top, more or less. Another project by Manon, which understood very carefully the section and how settlement is made, and then a project which is organized around these 2 parallel elements. And this project for Monte, which I just wish could be built because it's a building site at the moment, with this sort of open courtyard. And then we turned our attention again to Zurich and a project to create a synagogue for the liberal Jewish community in Zurich. A semester that started with a rather thorough examination of what a synagogue is as a building type, and an understanding that it really is 3 things. It's a place for the community, it's a place for study, and it's a place for religious observance. And again, working with the city of Zurich, we proposed 4 sites for projects. And where is he? Lucas. I told you I'd show it. Here the program is explored as 2 volumes with a courtyard. On the same site, another project where 2 students worked with these geometric arrangements. On another site, a project that looks at a more upright element with the secondary programs more at the lower levels on Weststrasse, and also on Weststrasse, next to an Orthodox synagogue, a project that proposes a garden in relation to the prayer space. on the same site, a project which is rather more Baroque in its quality. And here, a third project on the same site, which works with these stronger corners and the main space in the middle. And an image of the building in its setting. And then the last project is on the last site near the railway lines, and again a project that organizes 2 volumes, a tower-like volume which would also have housing in it, and a linear space that would form the prayer space. It's very nice at the end of that semester, the rabbi was one of the critics and was... Huh? He was also very good, yes. From the working with one community, a very particular community, we then went to Florence, which is like the sort of a city with the most intense collection of cultural artifacts one could think of, and a project that proposed a cultural center. We visited the city, and with the help of Karen Templin, we looked at a number of sites for this cultural center. It's understood as a building that is to help orientate people visiting the city to better understand what to see. Here, another site in a much denser place, rather sort of strong character. And another site and another project which, like all projects, is attempting to try and give a kind of contemporary expression to this really amazing architectural culture that we found ourselves looking at. And very much more recently, we worked in Genova. So it was a year where we looked at 2 port cities, Genova being the first, a site that is one of the islands that comes into the water, and projects that explored the low tower as a building type. Here, a drawing that shows a version of the interpretation of this urban plan. An exploration of the kind of organization of these towers, their sort of shapes, and at the end, towards the end of the semester, an interest in what the atmosphere of an apartment might be. And Rodrigo, you like this plan, don't you? Yeah, I do too. And always lots of models at many scales. And this last semester we were working in Antwerp, an area to the north of the city, a city I know reasonably well, and a very large project looking at a program of housing where every project explored the perimeter block as a building typology. And also the possibility that water becomes an element within the urban planning. Okay, I should go very much quickly. I don't have every semester of diploma. We weren't always so organized. But the first one we documented, which was, I don't know, is this being recorded? Okay, it was a very interesting diploma, working in this very interesting city. Yeah. But Yasmin's project was looking at a hotel, but I think in a very serious way. Mirella who later became a teaching assistant, looked at a project of affordable housing for migrant workers. And then under the directorship of Mario Botta, we worked in Bergamo in Italy, and projects that explored very different kinds of program. Here, Giorgia's project looks at a department store as a building type, or Lorenzo's work looking at an office building. And a particularly memorable diploma year when we worked again in Sardinia, but here, the biggest city on the island, and projects for a university campus near the historical center of the city. And really a very special collection of protagonists. Under Muk Petzert's directorship, we worked in Chiasso, of course very near to Mendrisio, during the COVID times, and Robert's project, which won the prize, had many amazing images of this college for textile studies, or Laura's project, Elisabetta, who's looking at sort of the idea of a facade that's about weaving or martyrs that creates this sort of wonderful covered space between inside and outside. Under Kirsten Gier's directorship, we worked in Brussels, and every student worked on a unique site which had very special demands and requirements. And Patrick, you see? I'm glad you're here. Bart's project that's restructuring a very difficult estate with a new wooden structure. Giulia, who made that beautiful house in Monte when we worked in the Valle do Muggio, worked at a much bigger scale and then finally, I want to show two other things that are aspects of many semesters' work. One, they're both a form of survey. This first one is where, as a way of exploring a building program, we invited the students to take a photograph, in this case of buildings that are related to employment uses, to take a photograph and then to make a model from the photograph as accurately as it's possible to do, with then the intention of photographing that model as a finished piece of work. And so the point being that the photograph is a smaller image and the bigger one is a model photographed by the students. And Maya, when you were younger, the test was always, could you see which was a photograph and which was a model photographed? And it didn't affect the students' mark, but it was always very, very fun. Another semester, when we were working on this hotel program, students traveled a lot in Switzerland and Italy, visiting hotels and photographing them, and again, making these models. And I always remember this guy, an American student, who hadn't quite realized that what it is that you photograph, you're then the author of the level of difficulty you have to work with. He spent half a semester making chairs to finish this piece of work. Bless him. But it's really impressive. It's a hotel in the Graubünden. And a lot of the time, it's about photographing domestic space, and always the encouragement to photograph not the place that you live yourself, but one that you can safely and comfortably gain access to. There are many of these. For me, it's just so exciting to see the commitment that is made to this task. The last suite are perhaps the easiest, actually, although not when you then get the Kunsthaus in Zurich to model. And I'll go through these very quickly, but another form of survey is then the drawing of facades, and you've seen anyway some of these in the... but an insistence that by drawing something, you work out how it is in terms of its proportional qualities, its organization. And these are some of the examples of buildings that we were looking at. Or in the case of Milan, which I've already talked about, so many seminal buildings that the students surveyed and drew. And in Lugano, smaller apartment buildings. And the thing that is always asked of a student is that they don't draw it in an idealized way, they draw it as they see it today. So satellite dishes and plants on balconies and all of these things are shown. Okay, this is probably another lecture, so I'm going to call it a day here, but I mean, another part of my activity as a teacher is research, and just to say that out of the work that I did in Zurich, I'm now working on a research project with Tom Avamate and Irina Davidovic and a postdoc, Giulia Scotto, and 2 PhDs, and this wonderful team. But we're looking at a project for that comes out of these 6 semesters that I did in Zurich. With another hour, I could maybe show that, but I won't. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I will try to be short, okay?
Pardon?
I will try to be short. Does anyone have questions?
Hi. First off, thank you very much. It was very insightful. I sort of picked up from the very start the specific word humanity you used in describing the Academy, Mendrisio. And I was curious as to where you saw the perceptions of a fairly successful Swiss architecture academy in sorry, I've just got to gather my thoughts. The perceptions of a Swiss architecture academy in claiming humanity as a part of their description, because I think there's quite a divide between a perception of architecture and the architectural work they do. I think Switzerland is the perfect place to sort of highlight this, because it is a place that has a lot of money. And so my question revolves around how you think as architects we can dissolve that barrier between negative perceptions and our work.
That's a very big question. I would always discuss with the students, my students, the sense that we as architects have responsibilities. And when you're working as a student, that relationship to the responsibility of architecture is a rather abstract one. That when you're making a project, you think of the things that interest you, but the work that you face when you leave a school of architecture is dealing with society, and it's dealing with the impact that has on the environment. And this is part of a discourse that certainly occurs in my teaching studio and many of my colleagues. And another thing just to underline is that I'm not unusual in this school, that my relationship to teaching is in balance with my commitment to practice. And I would argue that this is what makes my position in any way credible. That I think a lot of schools of architecture in Europe struggle to maintain this relationship between the practice of architecture and academia, which can be exploring things that in the end are not that useful beyond their research fascinations. So all of the design professors in Mendrisio are committed practitioners, and of course organizationally that can be challenging. I would also make another point, and it's in relation to what I was saying at the beginning about even the question why I teach. And to a certain extent, it comes out of selfishness. That what I get through the conversations that I have with my students is always enriching. That what they're interested in, it's great to be confronted by those interests. And I'm here every week, and there is a lot of conversation. And the needs of a profession are evolving. And I think as a teacher, the question you're always asking is your teaching still relevant? And that is a big question for me always. I'm not sure if I've really done justice to your question, but
That's okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
More questions?
Oh,
It's a gentle question. Jonathan, first of all, thank you very much. It's really extraordinary to see 15 years of teaching and its products reviewed so thoroughly and quickly. I was wondering, as I saw the progress of the work, because you can actually see changes and shifts in attention, not only in the, let's say, scale of your attentions, which of course are happening throughout, but in the methodologies of teaching, the devices that you use in order to have students grasp the essence of what they're attending to. And I was wondering if you, along with charting the changes in the products of the studio, if you noted that there are significant shifts and developments in your own methodologies and the devices that you use to get people to explore things and then to represent them.
I think that's a very good question, Mark.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Question mark. Certainly something that I've noticed in recent years is the students don't make as many models as they used to, physical models. And it was brought to my attention by a student recently that they're quite expensive, that there is a financial aspect of it. You know, when we're sort of saying, oh, make as many models as you can, they're thinking, I need to fund this. And what I have also realized is that the students are now really adept at making images and representations digitally. I mean, that skill is certainly not taught by me, who can't draw on a computer, but there is this sort of culture of understanding how to represent things which are about the representation of atmosphere and place, but not through model. I still encourage model making because I think it is, in the end, more revealing of the mistakes of a project as you develop it. But this is something I've certainly noticed recently as a shift that occurs. But in overall terms, the consistent interest I have is in cities and places and public programs, that architecture should be developing a relationship to society. And so in our studio, we don't tend to make houses for artists in beautiful landscapes. Some of my colleagues do that in a very interesting way, but that was never interesting for me. Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very impressive to see this body of work. And I know you work, I think, as a practice from the very first time it was published and swept over from England to Switzerland, and I was electrified, and I told you many times. And I was electrified because I thought there was a clear relation to Swiss architecture, looking at Swiss architecture, but taking it with a different sensibility. It was a very responsible architecture, an urban architecture, cultured architecture. But what fascinated me the most, and still does, is it had a specific personal feel that has to do with Stephen and you and the way you practice. And it's a feel that has to do with peculiar proportions, sensitivities of what surface is in a facade, construction and its limits, very, very architectural things. And when I see you teaching, I see that you teach in this responsible, cultured, and an urban matter, but you seem to restrain to be this master teacher that teaches your students exactly what you are so good at doing yourself. So my question is, A, why? And B, but that's also my own questions with teaching. How close or how do you liberate students so that they find their own sensitivity and capacity to do something in their own personal way?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and also a very generous question. To comment on the biographical side, the autobiographical aspect, Stephen and I found ourselves coming to Switzerland because we were fascinated by what we were seeing being built. And this is where we were really ambitious. We wanted our first projects to be as well built, as well coordinated as we were seeing with all of the brilliant architects working here. That was an ambition that we held. The other influence, which I think is very important, is not only London, but a group of architects that I found myself being drawn to, and particularly Tony Fretton, who I worked for and knew as a teacher with Mark Pimlott at the AA. And Tony's own story was so particular because he learned how to build when he was young, and then he gave up architecture and became a performance artist. And I think this combination of having a confidence with knowing how to build, but a fascination with the kind of strangeness of the human condition, I think is what makes, amongst other things, his work really, really special. And I think that sort of, that interest in making a work that is odd is just too interesting. You know, that not everything you can explain, although most things should be explainable. But I think where you have freedoms is when you work with proportion. But it was never, ever interesting for me that those kind of discussions that certainly Stephen and I would have been having in the past would be the basis of our teaching. Because, I mean, it would just be uninteresting and a bit of an imposition. And the students that, frankly, have always interested me the least are the ones that, in the first instance, do a bad copy of what they think is a Sergison Bates project. That's like the most uninteresting. I think finding your voice as an architect takes a long time. But as a teacher, and again, using the word selfish, it's always much more interesting to learn from what a student puts on the table than a sense that there is this house style that they're trying to create a relationship with. So, you know, when you understand how, you know, Mies van der Rohe taught, that's very uninteresting to me. I think it's always the students that do things that I could never imagine doing myself that I'm much more fascinated with. And I think that's one of the gifts of teaching. And I mean, I think there are certain consistencies or fascinations that I can see in the work of the students, but I think the relationship to what we do in practice, I always like to try and keep those apart.
Anyone?
Can we have a beer? Oh no.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I look how passionate you are about how you work as in profession as well as the teacher. And I would like to know also how is your balance between this personal, educational, and personal life? How you deal with it? Because I think you're traveling a lot, looking a lot of stuff, knowing a lot of people, but how it works for you, this balance?
I think there are two people in the room who might be able to answer that question better than me, but I really love what I do. And that, I think I'm extremely fortunate that I'm supported by so many people. There's so many wonderful collaborators who work with us. I've, from the beginning, felt that the collaborative aspect of architecture is really fantastic. That's, you talk about our work, not my work. And the balance is one that you're always trying to deal with. That, yeah, it's true. I mean, I travel a lot, but what I also know is that when I visit places where I'm invited to give a lecture or we have a project, I'm exposed to these amazing cities in Europe, and that's just a treat. It's an education. So all of that aspects of what we do is really a form of opportunity. For me, it's a big question, though, as a teacher, how demanding I should be, or how, I mean, because how I choose to live, I would never impose on anyone else. Although, I mean, I don't work insane hours. As a student, I never worked all night in my life. I think it's good to be organized, because when you're organized, I think you can take good decisions and not feel pressure. And I don't like feeling under pressure. I think the most pressure I ever felt in life was my last year at the AA. And it was a sort of psychological pressure that came from the school. And that wasn't pleasant. And I'm reminded of that as a teacher. I think if I see a feeling that students are struggling, then we need to talk. I think it's really important that we take care of ourselves and exercise and eat well and see things. And sometimes going to see a film adds as much to your work as just doing another drawing. So my advocacy would be enjoy architecture. Sometimes it's shitty, but you know, I think sometimes there are wonderful moments, and sometimes you have to manage disappointment. Actually, that quite a lot. Yeah. Look, there's someone's birthday to celebrate here. Come on, we got to.
Okay, thank you.